making a sourdough bread. This is an oatmeal sourdough bread. To start off with, I use 2 cups of water. This is purified water, by the way. Don't just take tap water. And this is my starter, which you can see is very bubbly. And you know a starter is good when you scoop it up and you put it into the water and it should float. So we need about a 1/4 cup of that. Or you can use, depends. Sometimes I use a 1/4, sometimes I use a 1/2. So actually, you know what? I want to use a 1/2 this time. So usually I wet my cup so it's not so sticky. So the starter, it's easy to scoop right out. You can see when you pour the starter, you can see how it floats. You know your starter is good. Okay, and usually I will mix this up. So that's my wet portion of the sourdough. You can use like a whisk like this. They call it the Danish whisk, but it's not necessary. You can use a spoon or a fork. So this is the wet portion, and now I'm gonna make my dry portion. Right here, and usually, let's see, so today, since I'm doing a steel cut oat, here we go, this is my steel cut oat. I'm gonna take a cup of this, and this is bread flour. Usually I'm gonna use 2 cups of bread flour. And then I'm gonna use basically 1 cup of whole wheat flour. Now, I'm using a white whole wheat flour, but you can use this normal whole wheat flour if you like. And then I add in basically 1.5 teaspoons of salt to the dry mixture. Mix the dry flours and the salt together, and also the oat. You can see the oat on the bottom. Now I put in 2 cups of water here. You might have to adjust it because you use different type of flours. They all have different ability to absorb different amounts of water. So you tweak it a bit. So let's see how much. Let's see if 2 cups of water is good for this particular mixture. You really just have very simple ingredient. All you have is basically filtered water, mixture of flours, and some salt. Okay, so you mix it up, and you're gonna let it sit. Looks like okay. You're gonna let it sit for maybe 10 minutes. and then come back and then knit this bread a little bit. So I'm going to let it sit for 10 minutes and let the liquid soak, let the flour soak up all the water. Then come back and knit the dough just for a little bit. Okay, so what I usually do is you can just put a saran wrap on top of it, or if you have like a disposable shower cap that you, one of those shower caps that you get from the hotels, you can just wrap it around. You see, I have a shower cap. It's a disposable shower cap that you get from the hotel. It's nice because it has elastic band and you can reuse them. So I'm going to let this sit for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Doesn't really matter so much. Let it sit. Let the dough rest a little bit and then we'll come back to it. Okay, so now it's 15 minutes later and let's take a look at our dough. So I always have a little bit of water on the side in case we need more water, and also I like to wet my hand so then the dough doesn't stick to my finger. You can see the dough is starting to get a bit of a stretchy, which is good. And I pick up the dough and I fold it just like this. Okay. I'll fold this a couple of times and it feels good against your finger. It has a nice resilient, a bounce to it. See? It's what you call, the bread has developed, the dough has developed some strength. You can see it's a little bit elastic. They call it developing strength. So when you have a lot of water, actually, you let it sit and the dough and the water just form this chemical reaction, or the physical reaction actually. So, if you don't have time, that's enough. You can just cover it up and let it sit for maybe around 10 hours or so, or 8 hours, depending on the temperature of your room. You let it sit until the bread rises about twice the size of this dough here, and you will see a little bit of bubble in it, and that's when you know it's ready. So the bread is looking pretty elastic. So sometimes if you are bored knitting, which I am not, you can always ask Alexa to play some music like this. Alexa, please play, let's play Scarlatti Well, there you go. This is Scarlatti D minor, by the way, K1, D minor, K1. All right. I think this is good. So now I'm gonna cover this up. And I'm just gonna let it sit for about 10 hours. And 8 to 10 hours. And then come back. So this is how it looks like after 10 hours or so. And it really depends on the temperature. Sometimes if the room temperature is cold, you might need to wait 12. Well, what I actually did was, I didn't have time to move to the next stage, so I actually moved this into the refrigerator. Of course, remember I had this thing on, always to keep this thing on. I put this in the refrigerator, and the next day I took it out. And then now this has been sitting in the room temperature for about an hour or so. So now to transfer that to a proofing basket, you take a thin scraper like this. Make sure you wet it in the water so it doesn't stick, so the dough doesn't stick to the scraper. wet my hand so the dough doesn't stick to my hand. And I basically lift up my dough like that. Oops. I forgot. I think the most important thing you have to do is before you transfer the dough into the proofing basket, you really have to dust the basket with flours. Now, if you can use rice flour, which gives it, it's just very. I like to use rice flours, but I don't have rice flour this time, so I just use whatever flour that I could find, which happens to be bread flour or whole wheat flour. Okay, this is coated. I'm going back to picking up my dough here. Transfer it over. See this better? Okay, now now of course make sure your hand is dry before you sprinkle more flour. Now you want to dust flowers on top. Again. Okay. So it doesn't stick to the side, and I like to turn it around to make sure that it's indeed not sticking. There you go. All right, looks good. So the plastic wrapper on top again. Shoot. Oh yes, that's how we do it. And then we're gonna leave this for about 2 hours or so, or maybe an hour and a half. Really depends on the temperature of your room. You want to basically have this bread rise just a little bit, enough so that when you push down, I'll show you, push down, the dimple doesn't really come right back. All right, I'll show you the next stage when we're up to that. So I bake my bread in this cast iron pot, large cast. This is a 5-quart one. And you can use a 3-quart if you're not baking a big loaf bread. But I usually preheat this cast iron pot at 500 degrees Fahrenheit for at least half an hour before you bake your bread, because if you want your bread to have a really nice crust, you want the temperature to be really high, and you want the lid on because the first 20 minutes of baking, you really want to trap all the steam inside here. So I'm going to put this into the oven and preheat it for at least half an hour at 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Alright, we're back. It's about 2 hours later, and now let's take a look at the bread. You can see the bread has risen. Nice. And so I'm going to transfer that into the oven. To do that, I use a piece of parchment paper and some kind of a flat surface to put on top. And I flipped it over just like that. You can see this is your bread. And if you want, you can scorch it on the top. You can lens it. I like this way. Alright, so let's go over to the oven. So now we're over at the oven where we have already preheated our cast iron for over 30 minutes. And I'm going to put on some mitts. Have my cast iron, open the lid, and drop in my bread. Like that. Put the lid on, tuck it in, and set the timer for 20 minutes. We'll come back after 20 minutes. So after 20 minutes, we're gonna, you can see here, I take off the lid. You can see, let me show you. The bread looks something like this. Okay, now we're gonna close the oven. I'm gonna turn down the heat to 475, and we're gonna set the timer for 15 minutes. So you can see after 15 minutes, I took this out of the oven. The pot is still very hot, you have to be very careful. And you can lift your bread out using the brush. There you go. Here's our bread. Beautiful. So let this cool. Because if you cut it right now, it's very hot and steam will come out, and also the bread itself, it's very moist. It's gonna stick to the knife. So let this cool for, I say, 15 minutes before you start cutting it. Enjoy.